I think all of us have well-intentioned friends who will try to say something of comfort to us in a difficult moment with the intention of trying to ease our pain or to help us to get through a difficult circumstance. And while I don't necessarily believe that those moments are the right time to correct people who are trying to be kind and trying to be loving, I do think that there's an opportunity for all of us to realize that sometimes it's better to say nothing than to say something that in the grand scheme of things may not necessarily be accurate. As someone who finds myself often in the circumstance of having to say something, you would think I would take my own recommendation and keep my mouth shut more. But here I am preaching again to all of you, and I hope that we don't find ourselves in that circumstance where you walk out of here today thinking it would have been better had he said nothing. One of the things that people often say in difficult circumstances to console their friends or family members has to do with the will of God. Oftentimes when people we know and love are experiencing some difficulty, we might find ourselves tempted, or we might hear others say, well, it's all part of God's plan, or, God never gives us anything that, we can't possibly carry. All the while laying at the feet of God some of the negative things that happen in the world. Time out here. That wasn't God's will. That wasn't part of God's plan. And so to lay it at God's feet and to assume that somehow God has, this negative thing part of his greater vision, I think is a theological misstep that is, God's got big shoulders, he can handle it, but he doesn't deserve it. And we paint a picture of a God whose plan is for all of us to endure misery so that he can then help us through it. Doesn't that seem a little off to you? It certainly does to me. My brothers and sisters, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is a high point in the life of the Church as it regards God's plan. And so I paint a bit of a picture juxtaposing what God does in his plan and what we sometimes ascribe to God in his plan, and understand that many times they are two entirely different things. Let's talk about today's feast as it relates to God's plan. Our first reading today shows us God's plan run amok. God's plan for us to live in complete communion with him, with one another, and with all of creation, and how pride drives all of us as a result of that first sin away from God, away from one another, living out of connection with all of creation. And it's into that experience that was not part of God's plan that God then plans to save us. Certainly, does God know that from all eternity? Absolutely. It's not as sequential as we might like to place it. But it's in that response, even to our disobedience, that God will plan for something greater, given the poor choices that you and I always make. That's a God of love. That even when God's plans are thwarted, God's response to that is to walk with us, to care for us, to carry us, to bring us out of that. We hear that in our second reading today, when St. Paul tells the Ephesians how full of blessing we all are. So often, we find ourselves wondering if we've got what it takes. God bless so many of you who are parents that have your children here with you today. God bless you. God bless you. And as much as you love your kids, I'm betting once in a while they might not be all that you would like them to be. Maybe I'm speaking too much about my own childhood, not about your children, but God bless you, right? And you realize, you wonder sometimes, do I have enough for what my child or my children need? And I suggest to you that you do. You do not because you do. You do because it is God's will that you be given, as St. Paul tells us in the second reading, every blessing that you need, every grace that you need. You've got it. Be open to it. And to not use those graces to live into what God has created us to be, even in a broken world, shame on us. That's not His will, that's ours. And we've got to accept responsibility for that. Our gospel today shows the ultimate of God's plan, where He desires to send His only begotten Son, not to send just any messenger, but to send His only Son to be with us, to share life with us, to lead us, to teach us. And so, in order that that might be made real, in order that that might be made manifest, from all time, God preserves Mary, the mother of the Lord, from the original stain of sin. That He plans in the fullness of time to allow His Son to come into the world, not to be thwarted by the missteps of sin, that Mary should not have to suffer that same dynamic that all of us suffer, even though she suffers like all of us in so many ways, in some ways even more. That's how God plans. God plans by placing grace in our lives all the time, no matter the circumstance, to prepare us to meet whatever life's challenges we may have. Prepares us to be able to respond even when we have sinned, even when we have fallen. My brothers and sisters, we rejoice today. I remember as a kid trying to learn the difference. I always used to think, I think this might be a misconception of probably if we polled all Catholics in the world and said, is the Immaculate Conception about Jesus or about Mary? I don't know what the percentage of right answers. I remember as a kid used to think that it was about Jesus being immaculately conceived, especially when we hear the gospel of the Annunciation on the feast. But rather, it's about Mary's Immaculate Conception, about her being prepared in advance to be the mother of the Lord. If God plans in the fullness of time to give her every grace, like St. Paul says, so too with you and me. We're given every grace for the day, every grace that the day will need, and more in abundance. Let us today celebrate Mary's Immaculate Conception and God's will that we be prepared for any opportunity that might come our way, for Jesus to be made manifest in the world, that He's preparing us to bring His Son into our homes, into our workplaces, wherever we might find ourselves today. And as we encounter difficulty, and as we see the brokenness of the world, may we not blame God's plan or God's will, but blame ourselves and realize that even broken and blameworthy as we are, we have been given all the grace we need to respond and to bear Christ in a world that needs Him so much.